Okay, welcome back to the summer corner that I have put myself in. So I guess by the rules of pop culture, that means I am not baby. But honestly, did any of us ever think that I would be? I think the answer is no. But I did read An Island Princess Starts a Scandal by Adriana Herrera this week, and there is definitely some baby in this book. This is, of course, the follow-up in the Las Leonas series that started with a Caribbean heiress in Paris, most notably known for being the series my book club is reading for the first time in real time, or I should say my romance book club. And obviously that's hyperbole, but we are loving this series. This is technically our pick for next month, but my library hold came in because I just had it on hold because I was already looking forward to it. We read A Caribbean Heiress in Paris a couple months ago. I don't remember when. We saw Adriana Herrera and Sarah McLean in conversation last summer at Printers Row Lit Fest. I'm hoping we might see something similar this year. That was a fantastic discussion. And the gravity with which they talked about romance. Gravity may be a strong word, but like they take romance seriously, right? It was not an afterthought. It was an active and engaged exploration of the current state of the genre. And this is Adriana Herrera's first series in the historical romance realm. And I personally, and my book club as well, really have noticed that we gravitate toward historicals because there is that element of fantasy almost to them in some ways. And we're so excited to get like a different kind of setting, a different angle to everything with A Caribbean Heiress in Paris. We also would love a screen adaptation of that series. And so ever since that book, I read that last summer, I have been itching to know what happened upstairs at the brothel in book one. So they go and we have that scene with Lucelana at the brothel, but we know that Manuela goes upstairs and we never find out what happened upstairs, except we open with what happened upstairs here because Herrera knows what we want. And so we find Manuela going upstairs and she is actively looking for a romantic encounter with a woman because she has gone on this trip to basically assemble her trousseau, or that is the kind of excuse of the trip. She is obviously with her two best friends, Lucelana and Aurora, whose book will be next, but this is kind of her last ditch kind of summer to kind of live her best life. She is going to be entering a marriage of convenience, but not the fun kind, because her family has historically had a lot of money, a lot of wealth. They were a really wealthy candle making empire, and that wealth has waned in recent years, leading Manuela to enter into this marriage. She is essentially being sold by her parents, and her parents are kind of holding this over her head in the sense that they had an investor at one point to kind of help bail them out of the business, and Manuela was caught with the daughter of that investor. Things went down, and her parents have been kind of holding this against her and using it as leverage to kind of force her into these decisions. But Manuela acknowledges at the beginning that she likes the comforts that her life has afforded her, and she knows that her desires do not align with society. And so she's basically acknowledging that as a lesbian, this last-ditch summer in Paris, where there is this community for people like Manuela, is her last effort to kind of live life on her own terms before settling down into this arranged marriage. And it is very much considered transactional from the outset in a way that I think we often explore in historical novels, but is very much laid bare here, especially because there is this limitation of knowing what the kind of risk of what Manuela truly desires is in terms of the larger societal context at this time. And so when she is upstairs, she finds herself kind of wandering around trying to look for a party to join, essentially, because there are all of these different rooms and this idea that if the door is open, you can enter, but if it's closed, you can't enter. And so she wanders into this room based on the artwork and finds herself taking off her shoes and like getting on this table to be able to see the piece that's hung higher or maybe on the ceiling. I don't quite remember better. And in the process, Cora, which we learned is short for Corazon, stumbles across Manuela, and Cora has been living abroad in Paris after some scandals in her own past, and she has been helping raise her stepson, who she is now preparing to launch back into British society because he wants to take his place in the House of Lords. But they have been kind of a unit in and of themselves, along with Cora's aunt and her group of friends, because Cora is well known in the Parisian Sapphic circles, and she is very much kind of like that more aloof leader. And she is also a really strong businesswoman that is trying to make a name for herself amidst the kind of world of men in business, especially in Paris. And so they are trying to get a railroad going in South America that is being hindered by this one parcel of land that Cora has been trying to get her hands on, because she is kind of at the head of this project and is playing a lot of chess pieces to keep herself there as the men are trying to discredit her at any given opportunity, which we see in a couple of scenes. The way they just kind of do these like subtle, except they're not subtle, but you know, men think they're subtle digs at her in these public spaces. And so oddly enough, except not oddly, because romance rules, Manuela owns the deed to this parcel of land. It has been gifted to her by her grandmother, and it kind of represents her one possibility of freedom, this one thing that is hers, a kind of protection of sorts, as she is being kind of sold to the highest bidder and at the whims of others at all times. And so this represents an escape of sorts. And so we've got Manuela, this young woman who is kind of trying to live large, court scandal in some ways, in this last-ditch effort to live her life as loudly as she possibly can before moving into this future that she does not want. And Cora, this woman who has been beset by scandal in the past, but is really trying to make a name for herself and keep control of her life and her circle at all costs. But in the midst of championing women and these circles of women, these groups of women, artists and scientists and what have you, she is still trying to play by men's rules in the world of business as well. And so we have these women with this baggage that are also seeking some connection that is so real. And so at first it starts out with Cora approaching Manuela because she finds out that this kind of mystery woman who had been in her rooms now holds the deed to this parcel of land that she really needs. And it's this kind of like, oh shit moment, right? But Manuela doesn't see it as an oh shit moment, because for Cora, Manuela represents someone that is like shaking her well-ordered life, right? She is an unknown that is upsetting the control, the tight control that Cora has over everything. And for Manuela, she has been seeing Cora as an opportunity for this grand adventure. And now she has these cards in her hand, and she plays them by telling Cora that she will sell her this land for an increased price, but also for the agreement that Cora will show her around the Sapphic circles of Paris for this summer, so that Manuela can have her grand adventure, because she has been kind of finding it lacking so far. She hasn't really made her way into those circles. And so Cora eventually agrees after being kind of pressured a little bit more by further circumstances, because she doesn't jump on it right away, even though Manuela holds, like we said, all the cards to this last piece that she really needs and wants, because she has shaken her so badly and represents a threat and a danger to Cora's way of life in a lot of ways. And so Cora continues to try and keep control of herself by kind of skirting the rules of the intent of what Manuela really wanted, because we know Manuela wants the kind of danger, the kind of scandal. She wants a summer of love and physicality and just freedom in a lot of ways. But Cora doesn't necessarily want to give that to her, because she can't give it to her herself, because she views Manuela as this kind of upsetting presence, as discussed, but she also can't bring herself to let Manuela have that with anyone else, at least at the outset. To the first part, not the second part. And so she starts taking Manuela on what she views as kind of safe excursions. Unfortunately for Cora and her forethought, she introduces Manuela to her circle of friends basically right away. And her circle of friends are very astute. They recognize what Manuela represents for Cora and how Manuela has shaken Cora at the outset. And they also dislike Manuela. But this also introduces Manuela to this group of artists and thinkers, and just represents a real new world of opportunity for her that she didn't even know existed, because she is an artist. She has a couple of paintings being shown at the Paris exhibit, because as we know from book one, they are in town for the World's Fair. And so we see these two women as they kind kind of continue to circle each other as they play these power games in some ways with each other. And I love the way that it explores that, because we have these characters where at the outset, Cora is the one that has the social power, the social capital in a lot of ways, and she also carries herself with a lot of control and the power in that in a lot of ways. And we see Manuela, who is on the outside more of a kind of free-spirited party girl of sorts, kind of undermine that power and the way that she is able to use her power to her benefit and what that looks like. And we see them kind of deconstructing a lot of themselves as they are looking at this other person and kind of re-examining what they want. And that adds a lot to the tension of this book, because of course we have the societal pressures, but they are always kind of explored through these very personal decisions and beats. So we recognize that the landscape of this is much different. You know, if these two decide to throw it all away for love, as we kind of like to see, or I like to see in many ways in these historical romances, that means something much different in the stakes of this novel. But I especially liked the way that this was explored, both with the communities it was recognizing, because it was drawing these really lush views of these kind of counterculture communities that existed at the time. And counterculture in the sense that they were against the main culture, but that feel very familiar now. And that is the truth of it. These communities have always been around. These subcultures have always been around, and breathing life into that is just really beautiful. And one thing I noted as well, because I read this book in like 3 different ways. I have the physical library book, I have a digital library book, and I also downloaded the audiobook on Hoopla. Don't judge me too much. They're all going back in the normal time frame. I just had them all on hold except the Hoopla, because you can download it at any time. So that's not hurting anybody, but I was just seeing what came in first, and they came in at the same time. And I'm one of those weirdos that really does like to read it in multiple ways, because if I'm reading it on the couch and then I want to go to bed but keep reading, I don't want to hold the book because I am lazy. I don't know. So anyway, short story long, I made note of the use of the word eccentric in this book when talking about family members that were considered eccentric, and how that word has historically been used, because I think we think of it now, especially in a historical fiction context, or at least I am guilty of kind of coding it this way, of like thinking of the eccentric maiden aunts is like one of the most common forms of seeing this. And obviously eccentric is used to kind of explore someone who has lived outside the bounds of society in some way, but I think it is so easy to take for granted, or at least I was examining this when looking at that word in the context of this book and the family members that are accepting of Manuela, and women who love other women historically, or people who live outside of the natural bounds of society, and also exploring those kind of natural bounds of society, right? Because Manuela's parents are totally willing to sell her into this loveless marriage to protect their own access to wealth and comforts, but they are not accepting of her loving another woman. And her father, this is a very specific and thought out moment, tells her very specifically he's proud of her in relation to her marrying this man that she does not care one whit about, and that she knows is kind of going out with mistresses on her. Like, that's an accepted fact of it. And so we see a word like eccentric, which has been kind of historically coded as this kind of judgmental, flippant, kind of dismissive exploration of someone, particularly women, who live outside of the bounds of whatever society has decided. And we see this especially with single women, or in this case, women who love other women, this idea that your worth is tied up into your relation to another man. And we explore this as well with Cora and her kind of desire to prove herself, but how she's still proving herself in a world on a man's terms, and defining herself by how men think of her in a lot of ways, even as she is this strong woman in her own right, and kind of really looking at all of this in a really active way, while still building this really delicious and sexy tension that plays out in all aspects. And so along with these ideas, we have this introduction to Manuela at the beginning of the book that says, unlike Manuela, who had never been strong enough to stand by her convictions if it meant losing her comforts. And so we are really seeing this like really nitpicky exploration of these two characters. We are really breaking them down to build them back up within the context of this novel, but also giving them a soft place to land in some ways. But they don't necessarily land there right away. They have to figure themselves out in order to figure their relationship out in a way that I also think is really beautiful, because it, one, indicates that you cannot be fixed by another person. Not that either of these two need fixing, but this idea that they were being kind of held back and limited in their emotional lives in some ways, or they were protecting themselves in some ways. And so they have to kind of claim what they want outside of a relationship for themselves before they can really define that. And so I think that that is really beautiful as well, and realistic in a lot of ways, but also then what you can do together past that. And I think that is reflected in the intimacy in the book as well, as evidenced by this passage. Manuela Caceres Galvin was a feast to be savored, a woman to love languidly with deliberate focus. Plundering and conquering was for men. Women plowed, cultivated. Manuela's body was sacred ground, and Cora would give it the devotion and nurturing it deserved until she harvested a bounty of moans and cries of pleasure. And so I do think it had a really interesting look at intimacy as well, because admittedly I haven't read as many lesbian romances as I probably should have. I'm trying to be more well-rounded in all of my romance reading, but I found myself thinking about how it was really interesting because, one, I would put this up with what I consider like one of my favorite lesbian historical romances, and admittedly the first that I read, Our Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics by Olivia Waite. But it had me thinking about, in straight romance, I don't want to discredit the fact that there are men who read and enjoy romance, but I do think that the intimacy in romance generally is written from a woman's point of view, or written with a female gaze in mind. It is a woman's pleasure that is kind of at the center of things in a lot of ways in these scenes, and in the way that we see characters develop and relationships develop in these scenes. And so it just had me thinking about kind of like the mechanics of the scene in some ways, and how both Cora and Manuela really need to be in focus in some ways. Soft focus for the intimacy, or whatever you desire, I guess, because there's some hot and heavy, steamy bits in here for sure, but that they both are being centered and both are forwarding in these moments. Not that both of our characters are not being centered and forwarding in some ways in straight romance, but there is a little bit more delicacy or a little difference there. Do you understand what I'm articulating? Maybe I don't, but I do think that that was a really interesting element. So as I said, I think that there was a lot of really interesting explorative work with our characters going on here. The tension was sustained really well throughout. I think the plotting of it was really strong, and it like moved. I had surprises in some of the twists it took, but it all felt like in a normal kind of pattern for me, while still kind of playing with and upending a lot of those beats. And the voice is just really strong. Part of the reason that tension is built so well is because the voice is so strong. It knows its characters, and more importantly, I think it knows how to build that tension, like I've talked about, both sexual and not. So we really feel that kind of emotional buildup that is leading to a lot of these other kind of like release valves in some ways. But what I will say, I found, and granted, I read most of this in the ebook, and so maybe it was a different file than was in the print book, I don't know. But I found so many typos, like words that had been jumbled like backwards, or words that had like fallen out of a sentence. You know how when you're writing and you just like forget to write the word down because you have the whole phrase in your head, things that are very normal from a writing process, and things that a traditional copywriting process, like that's one of the benefits of traditionally publishing, is you have that kind of weight of the publishing house behind you in terms of the editing, the copy editing, all of that, right? Like that's supposed to be the benefit of traditionally publishing. Now, I do know that most publishing professionals right now are completely overworked. So this isn't necessarily like me pointing at the direct editor of this book, like blaming anyone, because I think it is an industry problem. But granted, I don't know the turnaround of this book in the sense of I don't know when it was due, I don't know how long it had to go through edits, but it was about a year release between A Caribbean Heiress in Paris and An Island Princess Starts a Scandal. So that's a normal romance publishing turn time. And I think I'm not one of those people that like takes a library book and like marks typos in it. I don't usually kind of clue into typos, but there was at least one page that I noted that there were 2 or 3 typos just on one page. And again, I'm not talking like intricate grammar rule stuff because I'm not paying attention necessarily on that level. This is more jarring, kind of throwing you out of the world for a second kind of mistakes. I just don't think it's okay. One, because Herrera, by publishing through a traditional publishing house, has this assumption that they are taking care of these things, right? Like that's part of the package. But 2, this is a huge sapphic romance title. This is a huge historical sapphic romance title. We don't have a whole lot of sapphic historical romances, especially historical sapphic romances for women of color in like mainstream publishing, to my kind of cursory overview. I know that I'm not making like blanket statements here. It's never enough, right? We're still kind of like at the beginning for a lot of these stories. And so to take a story that is so delicious and so well crafted in every other way and kind of throw a reader out of the world for a second on technicalities just is unfair to the story as well. And so it was just kind of a bummer because that shouldn't be a thing. Like I felt bad because I've like even fought my mom on this when she's like complained about typos in a book. I'm like, well, things slip through. I tried to have grace for these things. I know mistakes happen, but this was at a scale where it wasn't just a couple. It was many. It was many. And like I said, it was often like words dropping out of a sentence or getting jumbled in a sentence, things that are very common in the writing process. When you're drafting, when you're moving things around, like that is part of the writing process. It's just gonna happen. I mean, outside of the formatting being correct in the book, there were times where I was like, am I actually reading an arc right now? Did I not realize? Did I download something that I didn't know? So I don't know. I debated bringing it up, but it is important and this book deserves better than that. Like I said, I loved it so much, so I just want it to be given the best possible chances for success. And unfortunately, I know that that is a real stumbling block for a lot of readers, especially readers who are just going to stumble across this book out and about in their daily life, as is ideal. Library users. I used to work in a library, a small town library. I have seen those grammar corrections in library books. I know it happens. You know it happens. If you don't, now you do. So it is just what it is. But like I said, everything else in this book is really stellar. I am loving this series. I am so excited for Aurora's book. I'm already kind of dreading this series being over. I'm kind of wondering if maybe we will get a book about Luz Alana's sister down the line. Maybe we'll get another series kind of focusing on her and some others. I don't know, because I would really, really love Herrera to do another historical series because I am loving this so much. And like I said, with A Caribbean Heiress in Paris, I am loving getting a new kind of setting for this series. Because don't get me wrong, I love London during the season, as we often get in historical romances right now, but I also love exploring different places. And I think that this series is kind of presenting another opportunity, or at least I hope it is like maybe a harbinger of getting more kind of like wide scale exploration of different settings and times and whatnot across the genre. Not that that is not happening across the genre, but we have been seeing a lot of series trending in a direction. And I'll admit I'm guilty of it as well. My own like historical romance reading has trended in that direction. You kind of like find your comfort areas, like you find your comfort fan fiction and just kind of like nestle in. But this is a great reminder of how many more fun places there are to explore. And I love the places we got to see here. And I loved the places we got to see here as much as I loved the places we got to see in A Caribbean Heiress in Paris. And I loved that some of these settings and these places in this book were really explorations of communities. And so I thought it was a lot of fun. I thought it was really sexy. It was really romantic. It was lovely. And so if you have been looking for something to take to the beach this summer, if you're looking for a nice steamy summer romance, a nice steamy historical summer romance, this is your book. And the more of us read it, the more likely my book club is in getting an adaptation. So you are really doing our group a public service by reading this book, but more importantly, you are doing yourself a public service by reading this book. So if you've read it, I would love to hear your thoughts on it, especially if maybe like I got a weird copy and you didn't encounter as many copy editing kind of notes as I did, but regardless, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for hanging out, as always, and listening to mine. Like, subscribe, comment, the whole shebang, whatever you're feeling. No pressure there, as always. Read something good, pressure there. And yeah, bye.